It's my great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, who will be Professor Piotr Winkelman from the University of California, San Diego. Professor Winkelman studies how emotion, cognition, and embodiment interact to shape conscious experience and social behavior using diverse methods from psychology and neuroscience.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me. I'm a psychologist, so I feel humbled to be at a meeting of all these fancy bio people. My only excuse or my only ticket to this crowd is that in San Diego we have an organization called Polish Biotech, which I have managed to successfully corrupt into basically an organization that now has philosophers and psychologists speak to biotech. So hopefully I will convert you all into psychologists. Okay, but really I'm really pleased to be here. And all right, so I'm actually at UCSD, but I have, and I was actually going to hide this affiliation with a Polish university. It's called SWPS. It's in Warsaw. It's a private university. And the reason I want to hide it is because I'm really interested in the Polish return programs, and you're not supposed to have an affiliation in Poland. So if you let me know how to avoid this requirement, I'll be very helpful. Great. So I'm going to be talking about my work on affect consciousness, and I'm going to try to link it to decisions. And I come at it from the perspective of a person who's always been kind of like an emotion theorist. And so trying to answer questions of like, what is an emotion? What is the thing? So everybody experiences emotions. We have all these feelings of sadness, desire, jealousy, maybe shyness, and all, the whole literature and art is all about emotions, poetry. But we have a hard time pinning it down. What is emotion? And so when I give lectures to students, I tell them, well, it's kind of like an orchestra. There's just lots of different components. It's like an omelet. There is cognition. Fear makes you look at the object of fear, makes you think, kind of risk-averse thoughts. There's motivation. Obviously, we move away from things that are dangerous. There's also expressions. We have these voices changes, faces change, postures change. We have all this physiological stuff, both on the level of kind of the brain and the periphery, so kind of the central and peripheral nervous system. But the queen, or kind of the key feature of emotion is a subjective experience. And as my psychiatry friend used to say, nobody goes to a psychiatrist because they have, most people don't go to psychiatrists because they have these. They go there because you have this. So if you're depressed or if you feel manic, it's the subjective experience, the feeling, it's the phenomenal consciousness, it's what philosopher calls qualia that is affected. And this is the only slide at this conference where you're going to see Sigmund Freud. So this tells you how much progress we've made in psychology. But I cite Freud because he is the guy who was interested in the unconscious, but he says it's surely the essence of an emotion that we should feel it. And other famous psychologists also said the same thing. And it's not only a theoretical question, but it's also a question of how we study, how we think about emotions in actually our research. So when you do any studies on emotion, they usually will give you things like, this is a SAM mannequin where you have to determine how much arousal you feel or how positive is what you feel. So this is the valence and the arousal idea. So you have these affective checklists. And for those of you who are interested in figuring what emotions does, so interesting seeing how it changes decision, behavior, stuff like this, many models assume that, for example, the influence of emotion on risk-taking is mediated by the use of feelings as kind of a shortcut to judgment. So, you're in a good mood or you took too much amphetamine, you feel positive arousal, you make more risky decisions because it's the feeling that mediates the emotion changes. So, and I, for many, many years, used to think like this, and I'm still best friends with people who think like this. And so one of my friends, and this is my kind of nod to neuroscience, is Brian Knudsen, who's a professor at Stanford. He's also a psychologist, but he calls himself affective neuroscientist. And we did this study a while ago, but we've also done many studies since which would show very similar effects. And Brian has built his whole career where we would show people pictures. This is supposed to be an erotic picture. I chose the least erotic of the erotic pictures, because I mean, you're such a refined crowd. And you watch these pictures, and they're supposed to be incidental, and then you have to make a simple decision. So it could be, in this particular study, it was a choice whether you want to gamble $1 or 10 cents, flip of the coin. So it's very easy to understand that if you are more risk-seeking, if you choose $1 because the losses are larger and the gains are larger, so the variance is higher. This is the risk-averse choice. And then while you're doing this, we're scanning your brain, and also in some studies, we're also asking you how you feel. Okay, so what you find in these types of studies is that sexy pictures, positive picture, exciting pictures will activate a structure called nucleus accumbens, which is part of, we used to call it reward processing things, but now we know the dopamine is mostly involved in kind of like incentive salient, but it's codes for kind of positive value. So that's what activates when you see the nudie, the sexy picture. This is also what activates when you are making a high-risk choice, risk-seeking choice, and you can do a kind of a overlap analysis and see this is kind of like the same area in the way people in neuroimaging define the same area. It's not for the single-cell people here, but it's the same kind of, the idea here is the common currency idea. And what's interesting is that, you know, these pictures increase risk-taking, so people not only choose more, have more risky choices, but also go to risk. But the cool thing in terms of, if you think about cool parts of neuroscience, is that we can do this kind of neuroprediction of choice. So we can actually show that the activity of nucleus accumbens mediates choice, and the sexy picture is going to shift you to the risk-seeking strategy the more they activate nucleus accumbens, okay? So we can predict what you're going to choose, whether sexy picture is going to influence you by the extent to which they activate accumbens. But one thing about that is that nucleus accumbens also almost very highly correlates with your self-reports of positive affect. It's not very shocking. People say when they see a sexy picture, these are male. These are not sophisticated creatures. They're males, as I've mentioned. So they just say, it's positive and it's arousing, okay? And you can also you don't need nucleus accumbens to do neuroprediction. You can just ask them how excited they are. And Brian Knudsen said that that's actually a measure of self-reported feelings is just as good of a neuropredictor. But I'm going to try to convince you, in the little time I have, that actually we should seriously entertain the concept that emotion, that the conscious part of emotion is actually not definitional, and it's maybe not even that important. And it always feels funny when I talk about it to neuroscientists. You know, I have a colleague at Caltech, Ralph Adolphs, who works on humans, but also is interested in bees and flies and things like that. And you know, for most neuroscientists, they study, for example, dopamine in those systems, you know, without assuming that bees' choices of risky patches are motivated by conscious feelings. So to you, it may feel completely trivial what I'm going to say, but from the perspective of a psychologist, and especially the traditional psychology, and trying to understand how emotion influences decision-making, this is interesting. So I've been, and there's other interesting elements to it, which I hopefully you appreciated. So about 20 years ago, we put out this thesis with my colleague Kent Berridge, whose studies actually dopamine. where we argued that basically you can't have emotions without conscious experience. So, so it's interesting. I think we're able to convince a few people, and from the perspective of kind of like funding NIH and kind of like the whole infrastructure of science, one interesting person that was convinced and is now almost universally hated by some neuroscientists, well, is hated by some neuroscientists, not universally hated, is famous Joe Ledoux. If you know anything about emotion, you probably know about the book Emotional Brain. It was a bestseller. And you know these examples of a snake in the woods and people jumping off the snake. Joe Ledoux used to talk about fear being driven by amygdala. But then he realized that lots of funding goes into drugs that, for example, reduce amygdala activity that have absolutely no effect on the fear experience. So I can reduce how much you startle, how much you sweat, how much your heart rate activates to these things without actually changing the feeling of fear. Or in the most dramatic example, you have a patient, the famous patient SM, this actually also Ralph Edels was involved in that study, who shows all sorts of impairments in affective learning because she does not have the amygdala. She does not have the amygdala. But recently in a paper, they were able to put SM in the state of panic by restricting oxygen. So it's possible to actually dissociate fear, the feelings of fear from the amygdala. And if these examples are not enough, let's see if I can, should I really try to play them? But maybe I won't play this thing. You can watch this movie about Terry Schiavo, who's going to appear in the next talk, but it's basically a patient in a vegetative state that, where the debate went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and she basically in this movie the physician is kind of touching her, and she does all sorts of avoidance movements. She acts as if she were unhappy because she avoids the stimulus. She has this a facial expression, and at the same time, the family was showing this movie, and the neurologist that declared her, there is no evidence for her being conscious because the neurologist agreed that these types of avoidance behaviors are driven by low-level circuits that are not basically accessible to consciousness, or then are not necessarily, these behaviors are not mediated by consciousness. And if you want more examples kind of from neurology, there are also anencephalic babies. I mean, there's debates about subcortical consciousness, but we know that there's some emotional behaviors like smiling that are shown by these babies. So my actually favorite study came out recently, and this is by the lab of John Wiley at Emory, where he had patients who were waiting for epilepsy surgery and took the opportunity to insert electrodes into amygdala and stimulate it. And it's a little bit like Brandon's lecture, where he was interested in whether kind of driving the physiology can be dissociated with subjective experience. So he collected measures of subjective experience, and I believe only one patient out of 16 patients in this paper reported fear, and I think only 3 patients out of the 16 reported having any conscious experience, while all these patients showed enhancement in heart rate, enhancement in sweating. So basically, he was able to drive kind of the amygdala influence on the sympathetic nervous system without creating subjective experience. So in short, I mean, looks like these circuits that underlie subjective experience and behavior can be dissociated. And now you can say, well, this is kind of interesting. What does it have to do with decisions? So my personal interest is basically can we get typical participants to be driven in their decision by affect without actually them experiencing affect as a subjective experience. So for these studies, I used facial expressions, which are kind of not only common, probably evolutionarily prepared, certainly have distinctive features. And we know that facial expressions from all sorts of other studies that you can create startle responses, modulate startle responses by showing people affective expressions. You can get people to mirror facial expressions, and you can drive, also pupillary responses. You can drive skin conductance responses. And we certainly know that you can drive behavior. In fact, marketing people, you put smileys on fish and giant smileys on people in Walmart in order to increase behavior. So perhaps the best known study that we did is it's known as the Kool-Aid study. It was inspired by a very disgusting drink that you can buy at Walmart. So what we did is we had people pour the drink into a cup and consume it, and also rate their mood and arousal. But before that, so this is what this is our behavior and decision is. But before that, we have people go through a task where we very briefly flash a bunch of happy faces, neutral faces, or angry faces. So it's a between subject design. So you're either primed or kind of exposed to very briefly presented happy faces, or let's say angry faces, but they are masked. They presented as a part of another task. So this is kind of implicit or kind of unconscious priming. And we're going to be looking at these two dependent measures. And basically what we find is we can increase how much you pour. So you pour more after happy faces than after angry faces. Increase how much you drink, more after happy than angry, without changing how positive you feel or how aroused you feel. So we would call it kind of unconscious emotion in the sense that we have the behavioral effect. We also have physiological effects. And so I'm going to skip this. We also have physiological effects, but we don't have kind of a subjective experience effect. How does it work? I think what affect is able to do, unconscious affect is able to do, is basically what we would call, in decision making, change the salience landscape. So if you're thinking about any decision, it has some positive sides. It has an upside or downside. So a novel drink, could be exciting, but it could be poisonous. A gamble, you could win something or you could lose something. So what I think affect does, and we have evidence for this, is changes the perception. So in the work that I have 3 more minutes, that I was going to show last, is basically we came back to the decision-making paradigm and trying to change people's simple gamble choices. So in that case, we rely on our faces, happy faces. We mask them with neutral faces, so participants consciously experience just a choice and a decision whether this is male or female. And then they make a decision in a slightly different gambling task. This is called the myopic loss aversion task, but essentially, you can either invest, and if you invest, you have a chance of winning more money than if you actually pass. But people are risk averse, so they often just pass. But anyway, we look at a proportion of investments. In other tasks, and this is just kind of a lot of these different paradigms we use. What's called a 3 cards. So you can choose cards that are low risk or high risk, or you can go through kind of like a tree of decisions which are more or less risky. Anyway, the bottom line is that all these tasks basically, in all these tasks, positive faces enhance risky choice, and negative faces decrease risky choice without creating a subjective experience. Again, so this is pretty strong. This is very consistent with this new work on decision making and learning, where affect, or positive stimuli in the world become associated with potential rewards, and the link becomes automatic such that you are more likely looking at the bright side of life, bright side of gamble, when you're in a state of positive affect. But it's not mediated by conscious feelings. It's a process that it's much more kind of front-end perceptual and attentional. I'm happy to talk about the details of this, because the details are kind of interesting, actually, how the affect is able to transform the landscape. A caveat that I always need to bring is, well, why did then evolution evolve conscious feelings? Why do we have feelings of fear, depression, sadness, mania? Why do we go to a psychiatrist? You know, what is the mechanisms? There's lots of good things that come with having conscious emotions. You can delay your decisions. You know, as I always say, jealousy, no, it's not jealousy, it's the revenge is a dish that is best served cold, right? So your colleague, your reviewer rejected your paper, you know, of course, you know, I should do study 11, you know, and then, you know, you're just waiting a year from then just to make sure that he has to do study 15 in his paper. You know, I mean, you can talk about them, you can regulate it, you can share them, social control. So life is fun because of its emotion, but it doesn't. But it can be through unconscious, also unconscious mechanisms. So sometimes I'm going to close. Sometimes you're happy, or maybe you're angry, or maybe you're jealous, or maybe you're envious, but you just don't know it. Okay. All right. Thank you.